Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another fun episode of Why Bother with your host, John Szablewski, the podcast that didn't need to be made by the host who really didn't want to make it. Today, I am joined by the ever-talented and very lovely Theresa Quinn, who is not only a fascinating person for her day-to-day life, but for everything that she's accomplished and brought to the community. So without further ado, I would love to introduce to you my guest today, Theresa Quinn. Hi, Theresa. How you doing today?
I'm great, John.
I am so happy that you have taken a few moments out of your busy life to speak with me today.
Not so busy.
So let's talk a little bit about how you and I know each other, and it's kind of an interesting story. And we're going to say it's interesting, even though I just asked you to teach me how to do something. But so I want to say it's been 2 years that I've known you now. Mm-hmm. And it all started because I got hired as a great pretender to play keyboard in a musical at Kenmore East High School. And I remember the week after that show, I called you and I said, wow, that show really kicked my butt. I need some help in getting these skills together. And luckily you said, I'm up for the challenge.
And I live to tell about it.
And you live to tell about it, which says so much at either how good of a teacher you are or how bad of a piano player I am. So whichever it takes. But no, so it's been fun, and on and off for the last 2 years, I've come to get your assistance when I've gotten a piece of music that I don't know what they were thinking when they wrote it. So. Yeah. So, Theresa, why don't we start talking a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got to be where you are today?
We don't have that much time, but so basically I am a musician that does a lot of things, and I make my living in a mix of things. I have a church job. I'm the music director at Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church. And I work in professional theater, and I own a dog. I work in professional theater. So I work quite a bit for MusicalFare Theatre in Amherst, in Snyder, New York. And I work as a gigging musician, and I compose here and there and do some arranging. And I just try to make a living as a music teacher and a professional musician.
That's fantastic. And you know what? I have to tell everybody listening, and I have not been endorsed to say this whatsoever, but Theresa is able to really make you feel that you have some sort of skill when you go to get a lesson from her, where you're not just a complete and utter disgrace to the profession. So she is awesome. And I've always felt very comfortable when I've come in and asked for your assistance and gotten a lesson. So thank you. And I hope at the end of this interview, everybody who's ever thought about playing piano signs up and does it. All right. So you've lived, and I know this because we've talked about it, but you've lived in different areas of the country throughout your life. And music has been a very big part of those areas that you've lived in. So could you talk a little bit about the different places you've lived and how music really is a huge part of those communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in Buffalo. I grew up outside of Buffalo. I grew up in the town of Wales and went to Iroquois, which had some really wonderful music teachers who were, there were actually quite a few musicians who, professional musicians who grew up in that system and were inspired by the teachers there. I went to school at Indiana University and moved back to Buffalo for a while. And then I lived in Nashville, Tennessee. Then I moved to New York City and then moved back to Buffalo. So out of all those places, when I went to school in Indiana, we would go drive up to Chicago and try to sit in places and try to hear music as much as we could there. And let's see, when I lived in Nashville, obviously there's a very big music scene and a lot of live music, so that almost every night you could you could go out every night. You can go out and see live music in Nashville. And I had the distinct advantage of being a house band, being in a house band, and having met a lot of musicians through that system where people would come in and sit in. And so I met a lot of musicians and had an opportunity to work as a songwriter for a super small publishing company there. So met a lot of people and learned a lot of styles of music. Let's see, then moved back to Buffalo and worked in a bunch of different places and started working in musical theater. And well, actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting this all out of order. Back to Buffalo, then Nashville, then I moved to New York City and gigged with a very large, very Italian wedding band on weekends, which is a whole nother funny little story. And then moved back to Buffalo and have been just doing a little bit of everything since. But New York City is different in, when the square footage is much more expensive, the chances of having live music are a little less possible in, because restaurants don't want to give up that table space. So gigging in New York City is a very different situation, obviously, than it is in Nashville.
So when you, as you're traveling and you're talking about these different avenues of music, was there one community that really stuck out to you that said, you know what, I just love being a part of this. This is the best music scene. I love everything about it. Which one of those would you say was probably the most influential to you?
Oh, I think Buffalo would have to be, just because there's a pretty good amount. Hopefully it will return to that. There's a pretty good amount of live music. It's a situation that when I feel like I want to gig and I get on the phone and start booking things, it's pretty easy to find venues. There's an advantage in that I play a bunch of styles of music. So that makes things a little easier for me. And I play with a bunch of wonderful sets of musicians. So there's always those avenues, and there's just a lot of them here. And then of course the theater scene is pretty great. There are 20 some theater companies in this town. So there's always a chance to play in that setting.
Yeah, so that's really cool. So we're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, because you first brought up theater and you brought up other concert gigs, and I want to touch on that a little later on in this interview. But before we get all there, so you're traveling, and I know you play numerous instruments, just because I've talked to you about it. But what was piano your first instrument? Was that what you started with?
Yeah, I was 5 years old, and someone gave my parents some electric keyboard, and it was all color coded. In fact, it took a little while for me to realize that music wasn't really organized in colors. What a shock that was!
Right.
So then I basically just wore that keyboard out, and my mom. There was a piano in the family that I think my mom grew up with it. And then that ended up in our household. And I just really drove my parents crazy. I think basically they ended up getting me piano lessons because they were so tired of hearing the same pieces all over. I'm like, oh my God, we got to change up this repertoire.
So can you remember one of those songs that you played to death 100 times?
Song books. Yeah, there were like these like pop versions of things with the notes that had the names of the notes inside of them, and there was like Alfie. What's it all about, Alfie? That tune, which was in this songbook, and so there were and raindrops keep falling on my head. It was the 60s and 70s. So, it was those kind of tunes. And I think they needed some change.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's funny. So I started piano lessons in 8th grade. I got 3 lessons from my band teacher because I started saxophone. And I'll never forget this. He said, you're going to learn this book. And I took it home and I worked on it. And then I said, I really want to play this one song to impress this girl in 8th grade.
So it really was just about a girl.
It was, I realized that throughout my life, just trying to impress the female sex has
Mhm.
been the reason why I've done much of anything.
I think that's really the grand motivating force for most guitar bands. You know that
Yeah.
most rock bands was really to impress a chick. So
Oh, I mean, because who wouldn't want to say, yeah, I do this, Oh my goodness. But that's great. So you started with piano. Now, when you move on to another instrument, were you self-taught? Did you take lessons? How did you do that?
Um, yes. Let's see. When I learned to play the guitar, when I moved to Nashville, I realized that when you went to songwriting sessions, there was no piano there. So I had to learn to play the guitar. But when you start as a pianist, the interesting thing is the piano is very, very visual. And once you understand chords, then I looked up online or through a book or something. I don't really even quite recall, and just figured out how to play the guitar that way. But I'm really just a fence painter. That's what they call it in Nashville, where you just strum chords. So
Sure.
yeah. But obviously, being a pianist and understanding music made that a lot easier.
So you said that when you would go to a session or something, there wouldn't be a piano. What was the
Mhm.
reason behind that? Is that we just didn't have space for it, or that people didn't really write on that?
Well, I think there are a lot of guitar players, and I think I wasn't particularly writing country music per se, but I think it's just the guys that I sat down and wrote with were guitar players, and it wasn't a situation where I would have to bring a keyboard in. Sometimes I would if I felt like I just didn't have enough ideas. Sometimes when you're a pianist, obviously sitting down and writing at the piano was something that was a little more innate to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed a lot more comfortable. But I think it's just not a lot of songwriters in Nashville. They just write on the guitar. And so, but that's good though. I mean, it taught me a lot about how guitar players were comfortable. I think when
Mm-hmm.
you spend time with musicians, when you learn to arrange for saxophone and guitar, you figure out what works best for them. And very often when I've had to arrange things at MusicalFare, we have this distinct possibility at MusicalFare, because there are just so many talented musicians in this town,
Mm-hmm.
that we have done a couple shows where the cast has been on stage and have been all musicians, and I've been hired to arrange shows for folks. So what I do is I just spend a little time with them and figure out
Mm-hmm.
what they're comfortable with, and literally write to spec for them. So that learning a little bit about the guitar was helpful in those situations.
Very cool. And the guitar, saxophone, all those instruments that you talk about, there's something about a saxophone, man. Like it's just like, oh yeah, seeing Bill Clinton blown away on a
Totally worked for him, didn't it?
tenor sax. I so when I was in school, I took alto. And then I got to alto saxophone, and then high school came around and they needed tenor saxophones. And my high school band teacher said, you should really man up and play the man version. So I said, okay, great. So I did I did the tenor. I said, are there girls that like this too? Like, piano, and then he gave me the baritone saxophone, and I said, I am not carrying this onto the bus. So we're
so
done.
that determines whether you play the baritone saxophone, the bass, or the cello. Yeah.
Can you
by the
get
way,
it on the bus?
Instruments do not have genders. I just want to point that out.
They do not. And I'm going to tell you, I don't know if that so-and-so is working anymore. Anyway, so the point is, you live and learn. So saxophone, all that. So you talk a little bit about arranging. Now, a few years ago, MusicalFare had an original musical, a Christmas show, Christmas Over the Tavern, which is based on the play Over the Tavern by Buffalo's own Tom Dudzik. So can you talk a little bit about that process and taking somebody's written work and then orchestrating it for a small, was it a 4 or 5 piece band?
Yeah, it was a 4 or 5 piece. Yeah, it's 4 pieces. Yeah. Yeah. But that's an interesting situation, because that's, Tom came to us with a piano score. And so I had to really just orchestrate out a piano score. And it was interesting too, because when I played the show the first time that it was done at MusicalFare, I kind of played the score like a pianist would play the score. And so I wrote the parts to halfway walk between what what was written and given to me in a score that I needed to stay true to, and the things that I knew needed to go into the score. So it was an interesting process because that's different than when you're creating a score completely by yourself. You're creating the score as a pianist. So starting from somebody else's piano score that aren't the things that you would innately play, that was an interesting process. So then I scored it out for bass. And in theater, we tend to have what are called utility players. These are folks who can play an array of woodwinds. Jimmy Renfola comes to mind, who's a great saxophone player and plays the clarinet very well and the flute very well. That we've used a lot of union musicians. So you tend to hire these folks who can add all sorts of color to a score, and then Peggy Scalza helped me write out the drum score, because the funny thing is that usually with drummers you can just say, okay, this is the kind of the feel that I need, but when it's not someone, the future drummers are going to be playing the score.
Sure.
And I generally know what drum scores look like, but drummers need to have a real drum score. So Peggy helped me with that.
That's so neat, to think about the process. Now, I obviously I've just started my career as a pit musician for these high school, and I'll say it again, I'm a great pretender. But
we all are to a certain extent.
But I've found that some of the older shows, you'll get you get this book of music, and the music director will just say, okay, you're gonna get it sometimes you get a month out if you're lucky, and they're like, we're gonna start 2 weeks before we open, and we'll have maybe 2 rehearsals before the cast comes in or whatever.
Yeah, it's quite a process
if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So I found that sometimes you get this score from this publishing house that's handwritten, and you can barely read what it is. And you would think that with technology, they could just hire an intern to fix this for us. But why do you think that we're not getting updated music that's easier for the musician to read with all this technology?
Well, I think to a certain extent, once a show is licensed and it's out there, it's being performed. I don't know if there's a grand impetus to spend the money to have it rescored or anything like that. With newer shows, it's interesting. We at MusicalFare did Fun Home. And right after we were the first regional theater to do it. So it was a relatively newer score, and it had been out on the national tour, but we were one of the first theaters. And there's going to be mistakes in scores, and I assume houses now, I keep an errata sheet and very often send them to let people know. Oh, there's a legal term. Sorry about that. It's the idea that you let them know what the mistakes in the score are, so that they can fix them. And electronically, it's so much easier to do that now. I'm sure there's going to be mistakes in the scores that I did for Christmas Over the Tavern, and music directors should let the publishing house, let them know so they can fix those scores, because they have the basics for them, so they can change them. So then nowadays you can get much clearer scores. But as you're alluding to, so if we do MusicalFare, we just don't have a ton of space backstage, and we're all union musicians, so you just can't have 40 people in an orchestra. So very often Jimmy and I will sit down and look at the woodwind scores and pick and choose out of things. If theoretically there were supposed to be 3 or 4 utility players or reed players, we'll go through and find the things in the array of scores of the things that we really like and I really feel like we need. So you try to get the most bang up for your buck out of the musicians that you've hired and are paying for each one of those shows. Plus, it's pretty tight back there.
Yeah, and I think I have a picture of an orchestra. I think this might be for MusicalFare. So let me just pull this up.
Yeah.
It is small, and it's not like a touring house where you have this this huge huge space, and there's a lot going on here.
Oh yeah, and we literally have to climb over things to get into those positions you're seeing. And Peggy Sales is right there in the closest in the picture. She's like right next to me. I can make eye contact with all the musicians. So I'm standing. You can see I have 2 keyboards there, and I'm standing and literally can whisper to the musicians and cue them by just looking at them. Because obviously I'm conducting from the keyboard, so my hands are busy. And so eye contact is really important. And it's actually really great to have us all right on top of each other, because then we can hear each other really well. When we did 710, we did Fun Home at 710, we were on stage, and the musicians, Peggy was really quite a distance from me. And so then I really had to conduct and make sure she could see my hand give her the downbeat. So in a lot of ways, that's a lot harder work when we're not really close. But trust me, we are right on top of each other. And so that was a picture from Violet. Larry Albert's a guitar player. Dave Siegfried is the bass player who's in the center. And that's Joe Donahue, who's over on the right, and Peggy Scelza on the bottom.
That is fun. It's really neat to see. Sometimes when I see a show at Shays or something that I've seen already, so it happens like Wicked 47 times. I mean, we got to see it again, because we might have missed, the way that Elphaba, flew or something. I don't know. Sometimes I'll look down at the orchestra during the intermission, or I remember this one time I saw a Book of Mormon in Rochester, and I was sitting in the front row because it was like a lottery or something. And definitely I would never buy tickets for the front row, because it's like the movie theater, that scene in Seinfeld where Elaine and Jerry are just like on their back looking up at the screen. But I just remember, and this is so interesting, because I think in musicals right now, where we almost are losing instrumentation a little bit to computers and to keyboards. So in the Book of Mormon, there's all these trumpets. Like in the recording, you'll hear these trumpets. In the show, you hear these trumpets. And we were sitting there, and I said, there's something about this trumpet. It sounds flat. There's something really strange about it. So I just asked the conductor at intermission. He said, oh yeah, we don't have any brass down here at all. And I said, but he's like, oh yeah, it's all the patches. So I was like, you couldn't get one trumpet player.
Well, maybe the theory was that if it was a little bit off key, people would think it was a live musician. But I'll tell you, the live musicians in this town are great. They wouldn't play off key.
Not at all. And I'm like, not one. and
well, you work that out over all the stops along a national tour. That's it's a lot of money. But there are houses. When you see shows at Shays, that there are a lot of local musicians that get hired just locally to play those, and they're great players, and they're folks that I work with at MusicalFare, and it's wonderful to hear, and you can tell the difference when it's live musicians. The funny thing is, when you look at that photo, you can see there's a tiny, tiny little screen that is right in front of me. And that's all we see of the stage. Now, since this point, we've gotten a better screen. This was like a 1980s, like computer screen. But it was great about it is that when it would go black on stage, I could see the stage. It would like flip. Things that are white or black, but I could see when the actors were in place. But that's all we ever see at shows. I often laugh when I get to actually go see theater. I'm like, oh, this is what lighting and costumes look like. These people, running from either side of us. The musicians were kind of in the middle, and there's the wing space on either side, and you see these people fly by. And I never actually get to see Carrie Drose's beautiful costumes. I never get to see Susan Drose's beautiful wigs, because these people are a blur past me. And then I don't really ever get to see the shows.
Sure. It's different. I mean, you might play a show, I don't know, 12, 15, 16 times, or, however long the run happens to be.
Oh, man, at MusicalFare, we do 6 shows a week.
6 shows. Weeks, yeah. So, okay. So my math was a little off, but it's
a lot of shows.
A lot of shows. And I've noticed this. So I usually get hired to play like a high school show. That's usually maybe 3 or 4 performances. I gotta tell you, usually after the 4th performance, like, I am done with this show. I don't like, like, so how do you, as a musician, that, there's really not necessarily too much room for freedom in a musical, because, you have to hit that cue. You gotta hit that mark, and people are expecting some, the actors have learned to understand a certain sound or cue system. So how do you make it so that you don't want to just, walk into the ocean?
Well, I love playing 6 shows a week, but it really just also, it depends on the show, but our job is to be as absolutely consistent as possible. But I hate to say it, but actors have been known to skip some measures and things happen on stage. And I mean, we're pretty fortunate at MusicalFare that we have tons of runs before a show opens. But so to kind of get all those quirks, but it's about living in the moment. So you're constantly trying to listen to live in the moment and to keep that ensemble together. And so really, once a show starts, I'm not bored. There are a couple shows that if they're not musically demanding, then I can, sometimes, get a crossword in or something, but, or do a little legal work or something. But mostly it's really about just trying to be as consistent as possible. And, musicals, some of the shows we've done, I think of shows like Sweeney Todd, another one of my favorite shows to ever play that I could play every day until I die would be In the Heights. Shows like that are musically demanding. You just can't wait to show up and play it again. And, Fun Home was definitely a show that I could play every day until I die.
Well, it would have to be fun because it's in the title, right?
And in a lot of ways, that is a tough show for so many other reasons. That was a show, there were a couple moments in that show that I never, ever got through without losing it. And in fact, I had posted something on social media afterwards about I never got through Michelle Benson's tune, the Mother's tune, without crying. And people in the cast, including Michelle, and in the orchestra said the same thing. I mean, we're living in the moment as much as the actors are, and as much as the audience are living in it and experiencing it. And man, it would give me every flipping time.
Oh my God. Well, that just is a testament to how vested you are as a musician, and how important the musicians are to forwarding the story. I mean, I think that sometimes people forget that just because there may be 20 people on stage, sometimes, some of these shows have maybe 5-6 people that are playing the music, sometimes more. And then there's people backstage doing it. So it's a huge effort.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And it's really not just, we're just not focusing on the people singing and dancing. There's a lot of work that's happening throughout that entire thing,
Yeah, and the stage managers and the house folks and the sound folks and the lighting, and there's just an awful lot going on. I have a kitten that just will not leave my older cat alone. They're wrestling upstairs. You're wondering what in the world's going on in my house. I realize this happens now to people when.
Zoom meetings. It's the new normal. It's the new normal. So we're talking about this, orchestra. Maybe people understand. You always see people walk down if you're able to see the orchestra and look at what's going on down there. I think that there's an inherent fascination about that. But does it ever surprise you that you're able to have, I don't know, let's just make it an even number. Let's say 75 people. That's an odd number, but let's just say 75 people working together on any given time to make a show happen. And somehow or other, all 75 people are able to work together so that a cue isn't missed, so that the music starts, so that the lights go up. It's just fascinating that is something that we as human beings, as flawed as we are able to manage. It's fascinating.
Well, and it's interesting too, when you're a pianist and you grow up practicing alone, I think that's one of the reasons why I so enjoy working in theater, is that I spend so much time alone, and you walk onto stage in a recital and you're alone. And I love that ensemble work. And you as a saxophone player, you grew up playing in a band, and unless you were did a lot of accompanying when I was
Mhm.
in high school and college, and I just enjoyed the ensemble effort of it all. Well, theater is the ultimate ensemble effort, for everyone who has their niche of talent. And I know people, they see the performers and that's what they view theater is. But
Mhm.
when I see theater in my mind, I see all the folks that add to every production. And that's what I always think of with theater folks. I always
Yeah.
think the folks that I'm dealing with in production meetings, and I love that ensemble nature of it. And I can appreciate solo playing, and I do it to a certain extent. But man, there's just nothing like theater.
Working with it, and it's every performance is going to be different, no matter how together it is. It's great. And I definitely love it. And as a teacher, and you're a teacher as well, but it's something about seeing people that you've worked with. So now I don't necessarily teach theater at school, right? But
Mhm.
I work with and as an art teacher, you'd think I'd be doing more with the set, but I always get asked to play in the pit. I don't. I guess they just go
You can
with
do
the.
both.
I can do both, painting and playing at one time. But it's. I just know that I get a huge appreciation when that opening night, the curtain call's going,
Mm,
the kids are getting the applause, and
mm.
you, even though you didn't directly see it, but you see someone that you were there with through that whole time succeed. It's a really cool thing. So
Yeah, I
I
enjoy that about teaching piano too. I teach piano and voice, and it's watching kids over their first recital and setting up, trying to get them ready for that first recital, and I'm just so proud watching that process. And yeah, and you must feel that too. I mean, it's tough for the musicians too, because they're hired. They're not really part of that whole rehearsal
yeah.
process. They're hired in tech week, and you can see, I'm sure, as a musician hired in the tech week, the improvement over the course of the week before it opens. And
Yes.
man, sometimes you're not too sure it's going to come together, and it
I
does.
I played a show a year and a half ago, and we had to vamp this entrance, and I don't know what was going on, but backstage every night it was like a 4-minute vamp. I'm like, what are we doing here? And I thought about that too. I was like, it doesn't matter what you do. Humans are also humans.
And this is why you can't have recordings for the musicals, because things happen, as they say.
Oh, that's so funny. So let's talk about you as a musical director, or a music director for a musical. So do you remember the first show you ever music directed?
Oh gosh. Well, for years when I taught in high school, I taught at Mount St. Mary and the Buffalo Seminary, and I taught for a little bit at Cardinal O'Hara. I
Mhm.
had worked with kids getting, obviously playing the musical and music directing. But my first professional show um, I did for BUA. It was a very successful production of My Name is Alice.
Hmm.
And I got the gig because Michael Hake
Mhm.
was a music director that I went to high school with Michael. He had referred me to the gig because they needed a female music director, and I was on stage for the show, and it was a show of vignettes
Mhm.
about women,
Mhm.
and so they needed a female music director. And then I had worked with Michael Hake and played second keyboard for a lot of shows at MusicalFare before I left for Nashville. So uh, those were my first professional shows,
Mhm.
and I was helping Randy clean out his basement, and I found the canceled checks for those first couple shows I played for him in MusicalFare in the early 1990s.
I think it's okay to get rid of those now. I think the money has changed the accounts.
I
You're
was very happy to see that my signature had remained the same when I
oh,
saw where I endorsed them. The only thing in my life that's been consistent.
oh, the signature. Yeah, that's great. So you've done that now. I like to, when I play a show, I usually do keyboard 2 or 3. It's
Mhm.
never I never play the big part, because that's for the good people. So I thank you for laughing at these terrible jokes. Um, So
I know we've actually, you and I have sifted through some second piano parts on a lot of things. And sometimes it's much harder to play the second piano part because it isn't really related to everything it accompanies. So I know exactly what
yes,
you're talking about. Yeah.
and I find it so fascinating. So I've played Leader of the Pack, which was so much fun to play, and it actually doubled a lot of the normal piano part. And then I've played shows like She Loves Me, where I don't know why I'm playing what I'm playing. Like, what is this? What is this? Why do we have this random gliss in the middle of nothing happening? I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're just seeing one little piece of that much larger puzzle.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So, and then you have like shows like Little Shop, which the main piano part is 100 times easier than whatever they gave you in this keyboard
Yeah,
book.
as the repeated eighth notes and that kind of 50s piano thing.
Yeah. So, but it's really, really, really neat. And now I've completely lost my. Oh, yes. So I talked to these piano players and I asked them, what was the most challenging show you ever had to play? And I'm always surprised that this is the answer I always get.
What is it?
Seussical.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know why, but I've heard that from like 4 piano players that Seussical is the most challenging.
I haven't played the show, so I can't tell you, but I find sometimes the most challenging are shows where they're arranged for big band and you're playing a reduction that is a big band. And the things that come to mind are City of Angels. I just recently played Elf, and that was Elf was written for a very large orchestra where I was playing a reduction. Let's see, we did a couple years ago a very funny piece that I wish more people had seen because I thought it was great. Was called Adrift in Macau.
Oh, and yes.
Yeah, I
reviewed that show for you guys. I
loved
it.
The cast was wonderful, and the music was just. We as the musicians just loved it, and we had a lot of fun with it. So, but that was another show where it was as a pianist, I'm playing a reduction, but probably the most demanding show for musicians might be Sweeney Todd. I mentioned earlier In the Heights because Lin-Manuel Miranda had on purpose made sure that every different style of Latin music was represented in the Heights. And as a pianist playing those Latin octaves, it's just so much fun, but a pretty challenging score.
Sure. So that's interesting, and In the Heights, I remember seeing that at MusicalFare, and that was phenomenal. And that was actually the first time that I had ever been introduced to Lin-Manuel because he had written that, and that he did very well with, and then obviously would go on to do Hamilton, and then now movie music for Disney. So he's definitely taken off, and that's so.
He's got a big future.
He's got a big, I sure hope that this musical career of his lasts. It's right up there with. I sure hope Paul McCartney still has what it takes. It's hard.
Well, we're looking forward to it. There was an opportunity to do In the Heights again, and hopefully after all of this is over, we'll have a chance to do that show again because, man, it is just a fun show to play.
Yeah, and it was fun for the audience too to see with that. So let's talk a little bit about these pictures that you've submitted with us today. And now you said earlier, not only do you do theater, but you also have a whole bunch of. At any given week, I feel like I could, before pre-COVID, I could see Theresa playing or talking about like 37 concerts in a Saturday. So it's amazing how many that she's done. So let's talk a little bit about what we have here. And here it goes. Okay, sorry. So what's happening here?
Oh, okay. So this is I have a group that's very, very flexible, and we do a whole bunch of styles of music. And sometimes it's the Theresa Quinn trio, sometimes it's a quartet, sometimes it's 8 of us, depending on what the gig is. So that's the tremendous trombonist Phil Sims and Jim Baum. That's Nick Corallo, who we are common friends with.
Oh yeah,
and you can see
that was the 8th grade piano teacher, by the way. He said, "So what do you want to learn?"
Yeah, Nick is a wonderful guy and a really great drummer. And you can't see off to the right, but you can see them in other pictures. Are two female singers that I often work with.
Mhm.
Annie Deck-Miller and Stephanie Bax. So this was curtain up one year, and outside, and it's sometimes it's an outdoor gig, and sometimes it's a really small bar, and sometimes it's very large places.
Mhm.
So everything's interesting, and all different styles of music, and it's just great as a musician to be able to play all sorts
Yeah.
of stuff. Yeah.
What do we got going on here?
So we do kind of an Andrews Sisters sort of thing here, and that's Stephanie, Ann, and I at the Naval Park, and so and obviously that's kind of 40s music that we do in that gig.
A lot of Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy.
Yeah, it's very heavily requested. Oh, and this is Randy Kramer, who I am married to. And this is our four hands show called A Girl, a Guy, a Piano. So MusicalFare is this amazing cabaret space they built a couple years ago. And we developed this cabaret, which is four hands music and a real mix of styles, and it's something we've done a lot of times. We've done it in theaters in Florida. We recently did a live stream MusicalFare to just, it's been a real godsend. We've been doing the third Thursdays of the month, a live stream series. And we started the series doing this four-hand show, A Girl, a Guy, Piano. So I've had an opportunity to do a lot of great, really wonderfully curated cabarets there. Like I did a night of, I love Randy Newman. And so I did a night of all Randy Newman tunes. And that's something really specific and a real specific musical taste.
Yeah.
But in a cabaret space like that, you can curate these very specific cabarets.
Oh, Randy Newman. I think I remember you posting on Facebook about that. And he wrote the theme song to Monk. And I absolutely
We
love
started the show with that.
It's a jungle out here. I love that song. And then I Love LA, which was written for the Naked Gun movie. So there you go. But he's and then You've Got a Friend in Me, and I could go on forever, but he's fun. I like Randy
Well,
Newman.
and a little bit controversial too. So it was an interesting cabaret to do because I did some of the controversial tunes. He wrote specifically with a view of two sides of a story, and one side and the controversial side of it. And so, it was an unusual cabaret, and only in places like that cabaret at MusicalFare can you do something that specific and perhaps a little controversial.
Sure. Now, this picture I'm about to put up looks like it is from maybe Ring of Fire.
Yeah.
And
so this is an example of one of these shows where all the musicians were on stage, and there was no pit band. Everything happened on stage, and this is a really wonderful thing about Buffalo, because there are just so many talent performers here that we can do something like this. And it was a very successful show. We did it both at MusicalFare and at Shea 710. And we all kind of switched up instruments. I played the guitar and the accordion and various and the piano and various percussion instruments every once in a while. But the cast was just tremendous musicians.
Yeah, and Ring of Fire, if I remember correctly, actually it's all coming full circle, because Ring of Fire was born at Studio Arena in Buffalo, and then it went to Broadway. It wasn't a very long run, if I remember correctly. It was like if you blinked, you missed it. And then it did a little bit of retooling, and then it was available for performance for regional theater companies. And then a MusicalFare did it, and then they remounted it back where it began at
710.
710. So wow, talk about a full circle there. But that is a fun show, and I absolutely love the first time I was ever introduced to the idea that actors could also be the musicians. I think in New York they did a performance of Sweeney Todd.
Sweeney Todd, yeah.
And
with Patti
then
LuPone. Yeah.
Patti LuPone. And then a few years later, they had done Company. I believe it was the same director had did that. And that was a phenomenal performance with the actors and the musicians. And I remember that one of the things that is challenging because you can't really have your music in front of you while you're doing that because nobody wants to watch page turns. So that must be a lot because not only do you have to memorize the lines and your blocking, but now you have to memorize this music, which probably is not that simple to begin with. So it's a lot going on there.
Well, you think of a show like Once where it was designed specifically where everybody was meant to be the musicians on stage. And that's a show that has to be completely memorized.
Yeah.
But, it's a different type of rehearsal process when, especially for Ring of Fire, because there was no set cast where this person, a particular person, plays the guitar or this person plays the fiddle. There was a lot of figuring out who was going to play what. And so it's a different type of rehearsal process. It's not like you have a score where one character is doing one thing. But that was directed by Michael Walling, and he was Ring of Fire was, and so he was really good at piecing that all together.
Sure. So when you get a show like that where there's I don't know, maybe let's say 15, 20 musicians, and how do they just give you a list of parts that say, okay, we need these 20 parts, and then we figure out where we go from there? Or do we say, okay, we're just going to start looking for drummers and bass players and guitar players and piano players and hope for the best? Like what do we do there?
Yeah, the casting process for shows like that are, people come in and, you ask them to list right on their resume what instruments they play. And, you look for the array of things, but you may need certain types, but really it is about, I get this list of every instrument they play and we find a way to it is like a puzzle. You put it all together and figure out, well, we could use fiddle here, we can use sax here. And then of course we had to figure out, where to hang them on stage so that we could grab them quickly. That was a whole choreography in itself. So,
sure.
Yeah. So it's just such a different process than any typical show, but it's part musical review. It's part choreography. It's it's a process.
It's a whole lot of stuff going on, but unfortunately you probably didn't have any, bass, baritone saxophone players because they didn't want to put it on the bus.
Well, in that case, if we could just find someplace to hang it, so that was the biggest problem for the whole thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. So, Theresa, if somebody wanted to take piano lessons or voice lessons with you, how did they go about doing that?
Well, they would just get in touch with me. So on Facebook, I have a page that is the Theresa Quinn Piano and Voice Studio. I also have a website that's theresaquinn.com, and you can just get a hold of me that way. And if you want to see where I'm playing, it's listed on there. And you can also go to MusicalFare.com, and hopefully we have a new season that will be up and running soon. We're working very hard to deal with the new rules of the game here. So I can't really tell people exactly what it's going to look like, but we have another season coming up and we'll be there for the next 30 years. They just celebrated their 30-year anniversary.
That's great. I'm going to be celebrating my 30-year anniversary in February. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Theresa. Why don't you just stick around for a second? I'll talk to you when we close off. Today, I was very lucky to have my piano mentor, Theresa Quinn, join us today for a great episode of Why Bother. I'm very, very happy that she was able to join us today. Please, if you enjoyed the show today, like and subscribe to Why Bother on Facebook and on YouTube. We would like to say special thanks to this month's sponsor, Krutinger Puppets. And we are now available on Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, and Anchor. I'm your host, John Szablewski, and this has been another episode of Why Bother.